What happens when a loss so profound, so painful, happens even before a life begins? When two souls are supposed to share this world, but one never sees the light of day? This is the story of Jesse and Elvis Presley, a bond forged in grief, a bond that shaped the king of rock and roll in ways that most of the world never knew. Jesse Presley, Elvis's stillborn twin brother, a name that for many years remained a whisper, a ghost in the shadow of Elvis's monumental legacy. Jesse was Elvis's twin brother, yet he never shared a single breath with him. He was born lifeless on January 8, 1935, while Elvis, the surviving twin, was left to carry not just the weight of his own life, but the echoes of a life that never came to be. From the very moment of his birth, Jesse's absence planted a deep scar on Elvis's heart, a scar that would bleed throughout his life, influencing every step he took. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was defined not only by his groundbreaking music, but by a grief that few truly understood, and even fewer knew the depth of the loss he carried inside. The weight of his twin's absence became a foundational event in Elvis's life, an invisible thread that wound its way through his public persona, his personal relationships, and his artistry. Elvis's rise to fame, a spectacle of charisma and revolutionary sound, was shadowed by the loss of the one person he should have been closest to. Jesse's death became a haunting presence, an unresolved grief that Elvis carried with him, even in his brightest moments. Jesse's death left an emotional void so vast that it shaped the very essence of who Elvis was. It wasn't just the loss of a sibling, it was the loss of a part of himself. For Elvis, it was never just about the music or the fame. It was about filling the emptiness left by Jesse, a search for something or someone that could somehow make up for the twin he lost. How did the death of Jesse Presley, a tragedy that took place before Elvis even had the chance to know his twin, shape the life of one of the world's most iconic figures? What kind of grief could linger for decades, never fully healed, yet fueling a man to become the greatest entertainer of all time? As we journey into the untold story of Elvis Presley and his twin brother Jesse, prepare to uncover a bond that transcends death, a bond that deeply influenced the music, the man and the legend we all know as the king of rock and roll. Elvis Presley was born to Vernon and Gladys Presley on January 8, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi. The birth of Elvis and his twin brother Jesse was supposed to be a moment of joy, the beginning of a new chapter for the Presley family. But Jesse's life ended before it truly began. His stillbirth marked the beginning of an emotional void that would linger in Elvis's life forever. From the moment Elvis drew his first breath, he was defined by an absence. In interviews, Elvis spoke rarely of his twin brother, but when he did, his eyes betrayed a depth of sorrow, a grief that words could not convey. Those who were close to him, like his aunt, his friends from childhood, and his mother Gladys, all described how the loss of Jesse haunted Elvis from an early age. His father Vernon, too, carried the weight of losing one child while the other survived. But it was Elvis who bore the heaviest burden. Elvis always talked about Jesse, his cousin, Patsy Presley, once said. It was like he was missing a part of himself. In his younger years, Elvis would often mention his twin in passing, as though trying to connect with the brother he never knew. This constant mention, without ever truly grieving in public, made it clear that Jesse's death was a defining moment in Elvis's life, one that he could never escape. Elvis's grief was not a mere passing sadness. It was a deep, soul-shattering wound. He carried it throughout his childhood, often displaying signs of loneliness and emotional pain. His desire to succeed, to be seen, to be loved, was deeply connected to this void left by Jesse. Fame for Elvis wasn't just about adoration. It was about filling a space that could never be fully filled. Growing up in Memphis, Elvis's life was far from easy. The Presley family lived in poverty, moving from one small, cramped house to another. Yet, despite the hardships, young Elvis had a dream that went beyond the confines of the small houses he called home. But it wasn't just the dream of fame that fueled him. Elvis, even as a child, wanted to make something of himself for a reason far deeper than vanity. It was to make his mother Gladys proud and to fill the silence left by the loss of Jesse. Gladys Presley, Elvis's mother, was deeply affected by the death of her second child. She too struggled with grief, and her sorrow was mirrored in Elvis's own struggles. Interviews with those close to Elvis revealed that he and his mother had a deeply connected, sometimes codependent relationship. Elvis would often pour out his pain to Gladys, who, despite her own emotional struggles, tried to be the anchor for her son. In one of his earliest interviews, Elvis confessed that it was his mother's encouragement that kept him going. "She used to tell me, Elvis, you've got something special, you've got to share it with the world." But the weight of Jesse's death never left Elvis. His desperate need for love, attention, and validation was directly tied to the loss of his twin. As a young boy, he believed that if he could just succeed, if he could just fill the void, maybe, just maybe, it would bring peace to the grief he carried. But as he grew older and began to pursue his music, the absence of Jesse continued to linger in his mind. The boy who was destined to be his closest companion was gone, and no amount of fame or success could fill the emptiness Elvis felt. This section has set the emotional foundation for the story. We see how Jesse's death defined Elvis in ways that went beyond the physical world. It created an emotional fracture within him, one that never fully healed. As Elvis's career began to take shape, the weight of this grief only intensified. His drive for success wasn't just about fame. It was an attempt to fill the emotional void that Jesse's absence had created. The audience now understands that Elvis's struggles with love, validation, and personal fulfillment were tied to a profound loss that shaped every aspect of his life. As Elvis Presley's fame skyrocketed in the late 1950s, his personal struggles began to magnify. The king of rock and roll had conquered the music world with his raw energy, his distinct voice, and his unapologetic persona. But beneath the glitz and glamour of his fame, a much darker battle raged within him. The loss of his twin brother Jesse, a loss that had never truly been addressed, began to seep into every corner of his life. Despite the adoring crowds, the screaming fans, and the world's obsession with his every move, Elvis found himself drowning in loneliness. "I feel so alone sometimes," he said in one of his rare candid interviews. "I mean, I'm surrounded by people, but it's like I'm still all by myself." It was this profound isolation, this disconnection from the world, that made Elvis a prisoner of his own fame. On the outside, he was everything the world had dreamed of: a rock star, a movie icon, the embodiment of rebellion. On the inside, however, he was still that little boy in Tupelo, haunted by the twin he never had the chance to know. As Elvis's fame grew, so did the emotional toll. His music reflected this inner turmoil, as songs like Heartbreak Hotel and Are You Lonesome Tonight resonated with the themes of isolation, yearning, and loss. These songs were not just hits, they were cathartic outlets for the grief that had long been buried within him. When Elvis sang, it was as though he was speaking directly to his twin, trying to make sense of a life he never fully understood. His relationships with those closest to him began to suffer as well. Elvis's marriage to Priscilla Presley, in particular, became strained under the weight of his unresolved grief. He loved Priscilla deeply, but his emotional walls were impenetrable. He could never fully open up about the loss of Jesse, a grief that he feared would drive those he loved away. In private moments, Elvis would confide in Priscilla about his deep sense of loss, but he often withdrew, unable to allow himself the vulnerability to truly heal. Priscilla later recalled in interviews that Elvis was constantly torn between his public persona and the man he truly was inside. While the world saw the king of rock and roll, confident, charismatic, larger than life, the man behind the persona was fragile, battling the internal echoes of a grief that had never been resolved. Elvis's inability to confront his grief led to increasing tensions in his personal life. His relationship with his mother, Gladys, continued to be a central aspect of his emotional world. Gladys had never truly recovered from the death of her second son, and her emotional dependence on Elvis was a constant source of strain. Elvis, still searching for love and validation, often found himself unable to provide the emotional support his mother needed, leading to mutual feelings of isolation. At the same time, his friendships with colleagues and bandmates began to fray. As Elvis spent more time on the road, surrounded by people who adored him, he grew more distant. He was increasingly dependent on his entourage, seeking out the comfort of people who only saw the king of rock and roll, never the broken man beneath the surface. This internal struggle was not just a matter of emotional difficulty, it also affected Elvis's mental health. His battles with depression became more pronounced, and his sense of self-worth was fragile. Despite his fame and fortune, Elvis often doubted his own identity. Was he truly loved for who he was, or was he merely a vessel for the world's fantasies? This deep uncertainty, tied to his unresolved grief over Jesse, created a cycle of self-doubt that Elvis could never fully break free from. As Elvis's fame grew, so did the complexity of his emotional conflict. His public success stood in stark contrast to his private pain, and this dichotomy began to erode the very relationships he held dear. Elvis was trapped in a cycle of searching for something to fill the void left by Jesse's absence, but the more he reached for fame, the more isolated he became. His music mirrored this internal conflict, but the question remained, could Elvis ever truly heal from the loss that had defined him from the start? The audience now feels the mounting pressure within Elvis, his need for connection, his internal struggle, and the deep grief that still hung over him like a shadow. By the late 1960s, Elvis Presley was at a crossroads. His career, once soaring in the 1950s with hits and movies, had started to stagnate. The king of rock and roll was now facing an entirely different challenge, not from the outside world, but from within. The unresolved grief over his twin brother Jesse, the trauma that had shaped him since birth, was now beginning to manifest in more dangerous and public ways. During a particularly intense recording session, Elvis broke down. The weight of his twin brother's death, a loss he had never fully processed, had begun to overwhelm him. For years, Elvis had buried his grief beneath his fame, beneath his success. But now, in the privacy of the studio, the facade began to crack. In the middle of recording, he suddenly stopped, his voice faltering, and he could no longer hold it in. "Elvis, what's wrong?" one of his backup singers asked, noticing the sudden shift in his demeanor. "I feel like there's something missing. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine," Elvis responded, his voice cracking. "Jesse Sepp's always there, you know, in everything I do. And I can make it go away." In that moment, Elvis revealed to the world what he had kept hidden for so long. His grief had built up over the years, and now it was spilling out in a moment of vulnerability that shocked his colleagues. This breakdown was not the first time Elvis had struggled in silence, but it was the first time the world saw the true weight of his pain. The news of his breakdown spread, but it was met with mixed reactions. Many were sympathetic, others were concerned about his mental health. Elvis, ever the perfectionist, hated being seen as vulnerable, especially in front of the people who admired him. But it was a necessary release, one that would change the course of his life and career. It wasn't just in the recording studio that Elvis allowed himself to show his vulnerability. During a press conference in 1970, Elvis took the opportunity to address his personal struggles. For the first time in public, he spoke candidly about the loss of Jesse. "There's something I've never really talked about," Elvis began, his eyes misty. "I lost my twin brother before I ever had a chance to meet him. His name was Jesse. He was always with me in everything I did, every song I sang, every move I made. I carried him with me all my life, and I guess I never really knew how to deal with that." This moment was a turning point in Elvis's public persona. The confident, charismatic king of rock and roll, who had always kept his personal life hidden behind a veil of mystery, was now vulnerable. Elvis no longer hid his grief from the world. He openly acknowledged the pain that had shaped him, the grief that had haunted him since his birth. It was as if he had finally come to terms with the fact that he could not outrun his past, that Jesse's memory would forever be a part of him. His confession wasn't just a revelation to the public, it was a personal reckoning. For decades, Elvis had felt alone in his grief, unable to reconcile the twin he had lost with the man he had become. But in that moment, by speaking about Jesse openly, he began to find peace. It wasn't a complete healing. Elvis would never fully heal from the loss of his brother, but it was a significant step forward. In the aftermath of this moment, many of Elvis's closest friends and family reflected on how this new openness affected him. His bandmates, who had seen him struggle for years, were relieved that he had finally confronted his pain. They noted that Elvis was different after that press conference. There was a quiet calm about him, a sense that he no longer had to carry the weight of his grief alone. This section represents the emotional peak of the story. Elvis's breakdown in the studio and his subsequent public revelation of his grief were the pivotal moments that marked his emotional turning point. For the first time in his life, Elvis confronted the pain he had been running from since his twin's death. The audience feels the weight of this moment, understanding that Elvis's vulnerability, though painful, was the first step toward healing. In this public unveiling of grief, Elvis not only liberated himself, but also connected with his fans in a deeper, more profound way. He had revealed his most personal struggle, and in doing so, found a sense of peace that had long eluded him. After Elvis's public unveiling of his grief, a new chapter began in his life, a chapter that sought healing, even if it was imperfect. Confronting the loss of his twin brother, Jesse, was a monumental step for Elvis, but it didn't automatically heal the wounds that had been festering for decades. Instead, it began a slow and painful process of acceptance. In the years following that pivotal moment, Elvis made subtle but significant changes to his personal life. One of the most notable was his increasing reliance on his faith. While Elvis had always had a complex relationship with religion, he began seeking solace through prayer and meditation. He visited spiritual advisors, and though he was still the same complex and contradictory man, there was a sense of introspection that hadn't been there before. He even found moments of comfort in the Bible, which he had kept close throughout his life. His newfound openness to faith wasn't just a reflection of his spiritual needs, it was a reflection of his emotional healing. Additionally, Elvis began to channel his grief into his music in ways that were even more raw and genuine than before. His later performances, especially the iconic Aloha from Hawaii concert, became more than just a spectacle of talent. They were personal expressions of a man working through his pain. Songs like The Impossible Dream and Unchained Melody carried the weight of his emotional journey, and when Elvis performed them, it wasn't just about entertaining his fans. It was about exorcising the demons he had lived with for so long. As he stood on stage, the king of rock and roll, dressed in his extravagant jumpsuits, was still the Elvis that millions adored. But those who listened closely, who watched intently, could sense the shift. There was a vulnerability in his voice now, an openness that had been absent before. His pain was still there, but it was no longer the driving force behind his need for validation. Music, which had always been an escape for him, became a way of confronting his past and embracing his future. Though Elvis attempted to heal, Jesse's absence remained a part of him until the end. Even in his later years, there were times when Elvis's grief would resurface in unexpected ways. His relationship with his fans, especially those who knew of his struggles, grew even deeper. The public's connection with Elvis became less about the fame and more about the human being behind the iconic image. In his later years, as Elvis's health deteriorated, the weight of his grief resurfaced with a vengeance. It was clear that Elvis had never fully resolved the emotional scars of his youth. His struggles with prescription drugs and bouts of depression were well documented, and while some attributed them to the pressures of fame, those who were closest to him believed that his ongoing battle with grief played a significant role. Elvis's music, however, remained his saving grace. Songs like Burning Love and My Way became anthems of a man who had lived through personal storms, who had faced the depths of despair, but had come out the other side still singing. His voice, though tinged with sadness, carried a power that spoke to the hearts of his fans. Even as he struggled with his own demons, Elvis's music continued to inspire. His legacy, as a man who never fully healed from the loss of his twin, became a symbol for many of the power of grief, the pain of loss, and the resilience of the human spirit. Though he would never be free from the shadow of his twin brother's death, Elvis had managed to create something beautiful from his sorrow, a legacy that would live on, touching millions of lives long after his passing. In this section, we see how Elvis, though never fully free from the grief that had shaped him, began to make peace with his past. Through his faith, his music, and his relationships, he sought healing in ways that were deeply personal. While the pain of losing his twin brother never fully disappeared, Elvis found ways to channel it into his art, creating a lasting legacy that spoke to the human experience of love, loss, and healing. His story is one of redemption, showing that even in the face of unhealed wounds, it is possible to create something beautiful and enduring. Elvis Presley may have been the king of rock and roll, but it was the boy who lost his twin brother Jesse that was the real king of grief. Their bond, though unspoken, became the thread that tied Elvis's music to the very fabric of human experience. A man loved by millions, yet haunted by one loss that changed everything. Throughout his life, Elvis struggled with the absence of his twin. Jesse's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the cornerstone of Elvis's emotional landscape, the source of a deep yearning that manifested in his music, his relationships, and his public persona. Elvis's pain, his drive, and his vulnerability were all inextricably linked to that one moment of loss. Even as Elvis became an icon, the twin he never knew remained a constant presence in his life. The emotional weight of this story serves as a reminder that even the most famous, the most admired, are shaped by personal pain. Elvis's greatness didn't lie solely in his talent. It was in his ability to turn grief into art, to make his deepest sorrow resonate with millions of people. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy not just of music, but of raw, emotional honesty that continues to impact us to this day. Has there been a loss in your life that shaped who you are? A loss that changed the course of your journey, that left an indelible mark on your soul? We all carry grief in different ways, but as Elvis showed us, it's in confronting that grief that we find our truest selves. Share your thoughts below. Let's talk about how grief, love, and memory can shape the lives of the greatest among us. How have you navigated your own struggles, and how has it impacted your path? We'd love to hear your stories. If you found this story of Elvis and his twin brother Jesse moving, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories like this. Stories that go beyond the headlines to reveal the humanity of the people we think we know.